Good morning. My name is Allison and I work at Whitfield Wildlife Conservation Area. Today we're going to talk about diversity in habitat. But before we begin, I'd like everybody to grab a piece of paper and a pencil for today's lesson. All right, now that everyone has their piece of paper and pencil, we have to first figure out what a habitat is. So in order to talk about diversity in habitat, we need to figure out what it is. So what I'd like everybody to do is write down the word habitat. H-A-B-I-T-A-T, habitat. What is that? Well, a habitat is a place where plants and animals live. And there are many different types of habitats. Today we're going to look at two specific types of habitat. The first one is going to be right here at Whitfield, and that is called a riparian habitat. So the habitat here at Whitfield, this is what we would call a riparian habitat. Riparian is spelled R-I-P-A-R-I-A-N, and then habitat. That is a big word, so we got to figure out, what does riparian mean? Well, in order to have a riparian habitat, you need to have water. Now you can see that there is a giant pond behind me, right? Well, that giant pond actually shows us where the water is underneath the ground. So this water is usually underneath the ground. And in order for us to see it, we had to dig a giant hole, and that hole filled in with water. So that tells us that the groundwater, the water beneath our feet, is not very low because we're able to see this pond. So to have a riparian habitat, you need to have a habitat that's near water. Some people call this habitat a floodplain. There are many different types of plants and animals that grow and live in a riparian habitat. So let's now look and label some of those plants and animals that you'll see in our riparian habitat here at Whitfield. So since Whitfield is in the riparian habitat and we know that we need water, let's take a look at some of the plants that live around this area that need that groundwater as well. And one of the most thriving plants that we have here are these. And these are cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees need water, but we know in New Mexico, they don't get a lot of water from the sky. It doesn't rain a lot here, but they get their water underneath the ground. And you can see that the groundwater is not much lower than where the floor of the ground is here. So the roots of this tree are actually going to be in the water, which allows the plant to grow. So if you look behind me, you can actually see that this entire pond is surrounded by cottonwood trees. Some other plants we may see in a riparian habitat are willows. These are very common and they love being in the floodplain. They need a lot of water. But something that needs even more water than a willow or a cottonwood tree are these right here. And you can see, if you look out, you can see the whole pond is surrounded by these large, almost grass-looking things. Does anybody know what these might be called? Yeah, you may have guessed it. These are called cattails, and they need to be actually in water to survive. And cattails almost look like giant grass, but they have this sort of tail-looking thing. Do you know what's inside of this? You probably guessed it. The seeds. And the seeds spread in the wind, and that helps the cattails thrive in their habitat. There are many animals that actually use cattails for their habitat, and some of the animals that we may see that live among the cattails are birds and smaller animals like insects, dragonflies, bullfrogs, ducks. We have all kinds of different animals that are through this area throughout the year that actually use these cattails for their habitat. So they're very important that they're here in this pond. We have many different types of plants that live in the riparian habitat, like we did see the willow. But did you know that not all plants are great for this sort of habitat? In fact, some plants can actually get invasive, which means we find too many of them and they invade other plants such as the willow or the cottonwood tree that need to grow in the riparian habitat. So right here next to me, I have two examples of invasive species that we see in this habitat, and that is the salt cedar. The salt cedar, you can tell, has a really, really dark red stem here, and it has these little branches. And this salt cedar is really small, but actually will get really, really large. And if you look really closely at the bottom of a salt cedar, you will notice that a lot of plants can't survive next to it. And that's because the salt cedar soaks up and uses so much water. It actually takes water away from other plants around it. And it has a really, really thick, strong root system that allows it to grow and thrive. And it can actually push out other plants. Another invasive species we have, and these grow really large, this is a small one here, is a Russian olive. Now, what sounds weird about the word Russian olive? You probably guessed it. It has the word Russian in it, and we know we live in New Mexico, right? So this tree is actually not even from New Mexico, but it thrives because just like our salt cedar, it has a thick root system and pushes out any plants that grow near it. And also it has little tiny seeds that the birds love to eat. So what happens is the birds love to eat the little olive seeds, and when they do, wherever they poop, those seeds can grow up and turn into Russian olive trees. And unlike our cottonwood tree that needs to be in the water, the Russian olive needs water but not as much, and it's able to live a lot easier than our cottonwood tree and therefore can easily take over an area. So sometimes in the riparian area we see invasive species. So we have a lot of plants that live next to this pond, but we also have a lot of birds that fly in and use this pond throughout the year. So right now it's in September. The leaves are just starting to change. There's a really big bird that comes really shortly around October or even into November that'll stay all the way until March. And this is a migrating bird. Does anybody know what type of bird this is? I bet you guessed it. Yes, this is a sandhill crane. And we get thousands of them here at Whitfield. Sandhill cranes love the pond, they love the grasses, and they love being in the riparian habitat where there's lots of water. All right, so now that we've looked at plants and animals in the riparian habitat here at the pond, and we see there's a big diversity of life that grows and thrives here, now I'd like to show you an upland area, and let's see if you all can notice some differences of the habitat that you saw here versus the habitat that you'll see in an upland area, just a few miles from Whitfield. All right, everybody, welcome back. So we just saw the riparian habitat at Whitfield, and now you can see I'm in a habitat that you probably can already tell looks really different. Some obvious differences are there are way less plants, and the plants are also a lot smaller. And if you get really close down here, the soil looks different. This is more sandy. So we know that in order to get sandy soil like this, we're gonna have really strong winds in this area. So I'd like everybody to get their pens and paper out again, and we're gonna write our next term here called upland habitat. UPLAND habitat. So upland means up, right? Away from water. So as you can tell, we have no surface water here, but the groundwater is a lot lower, which means there are no cottonwood trees in this upland habitat. So our cottonwood trees could not survive in this habitat because the groundwater is too far beneath the surface. And so we have plants that can only survive with little bits of water. So this is an example of something you might see in an upland area. Common plants that grow up here would be this. This is called a snakeweed. You can tell that it's beautiful and blooming right now, and eventually these blooms will disappear and you won't see that beautiful yellow color. Over here we have a sage. Sage is something very common that you'll find in an upland area. And the nice thing about sage is it can be food for rabbits and small rodents, and it can also be shade. As you can see, there's not a lot of large trees for shade, so animals that live in an upland area would have to find shade in smaller plants like the sage. Another plant that you might see is way behind me, and this is a four-winged saltbrush. The four-winged saltbrush has a male and a female. The female are the ones that have the seeds. So here's an example of a male and female saltbrush. So the female would be the saltbrush with the seeds, and the male would be the saltbrush without the seeds. And you can see that they're very close together. So these are some of the plants that you would see in an upland area. There is a lot of life that can survive in an upland area. Some of the animals you might see up here would be a rabbit, and you would also see a larger animal like a coyote that might be chasing a rabbit. You may see a lizard. Some other animals you may see would be crickets, grasshoppers, and one of my favorite that likes to slither in the sand. Has anybody seen one of those? Yeah, a snake. And upland snakes, the ones that would be most common around here would be a prairie rattlesnake or a diamondback rattlesnake. Now, snakes aren't something that we need to be afraid of, but we also want to make sure that we stay out of their way. So if we see a snake, we want to make sure that we back up slowly and tell an adult. So now we've looked at a lot of different plants in the upland habitat. We talked about some of the different animals and reptiles that live in this area. I want you to think about the type of habitat that's right near your home or school. So what I'd like you to do for the next 15 minutes is go outside, and I'd like you to draw the habitat that's near you. And in order to have a diverse habitat, we need to make sure that we're including as many plants as you can. And you may not see any animals, but you want to include the animals that you think would live in the type of habitat that you have near you. So once you're looking at all of those plants and animals, you're thinking about, why is this habitat important, and why is it important to have so many different plants and animals that are near me? So I'd like you to take your time and draw, color, label, and then I'd like you to answer the question on the bottom of your drawing. Why is this habitat important in the environment? I can't wait to catch up with you all soon and see your drawings, and I hope that you are connecting with nature every day in every way. See you soon.